I want to start by telling you something about the beach house, because you need to understand what it meant before you can understand what they did. I bought it myself, every single penny of it. No inheritance, no gift, no help from anyone. I was 34 years old, and I had spent 6 years working 70-hour weeks and eating dinner at my desk and saying no to holidays and no to new cars and no to every version of spending that wasn't the number I had written on a piece of paper and stuck to the inside of my kitchen cupboard. That number was the deposit on a house by the sea. My house. The house I had been building towards since I was a little girl sitting on a beach in Devon with sand in my shoes thinking, one day I am going to live somewhere like this. I bought it in September, 6 years ago. 3 bedrooms, a small garden that ran down to a coastal path, a kitchen with a window that looked directly out to water. On clear mornings, you could see the horizon line from the kitchen table while you drank your coffee, and the light came in sideways, and everything was quiet except the gulls. It was the best thing I had ever done for myself. I want you to hold that. The house I built toward for 6 years and bought with my own hands and lived inside like it was proof that I existed, that I had made something, that I had managed, against considerable odds and with no safety net, to create something that was entirely and completely mine. I want you to hold it, because what my parents did with it tells you everything about who they are, and what I did about it tells you everything about how long it took me to become who I am. My name is Rachel. I am 41 years old. I live in the southwest of England, and I have, for the past 14 months, been engaged in a legal, financial, and deeply personal battle with the 2 people who raised me. I do not say that lightly. I am aware of how it sounds. I am aware that most people, when they hear a daughter has taken legal action against her own parents, assume, at least initially, that something must be wrong with the daughter. I would ask you to stay with me long enough to hear the full story before you decide. My parents are Gerald and Maureen. Gerald is 68, retired from a career in middle management that he has described as distinguished for as long as I can remember. Maureen is 66. She has not worked outside the home since I was born, which is her right, but which has also meant that Gerald's financial decisions have been the family's financial decisions for as long as either of them can remember. And Gerald's financial decisions have not always been good ones. I am their only child. This is relevant. When you are the only child of parents who do not manage money well and who have very fixed ideas about what children owe their parents, you become, over time, something that functions less like a daughter and more like a contingency plan. I didn't see it that way for a long time. I loved my parents. I still love them, in the complicated, grief-adjacent way that you love people who have hurt you badly. Not cleanly, not simply, but genuinely. Underneath everything. That love is part of why it took me so long to see what was happening, and it is part of why, when I finally did see it, the hurt was as large as it was. But I am getting ahead of myself. The pattern, because there was a pattern, and it had been running for years before the beach house, started small, as patterns like this always do. My parents had never been savers. Gerald had earned a reasonable salary throughout his career, but it had never seemed to accumulate into anything. There had always been a reason, a holiday that was really a necessity, a car upgrade that really couldn't wait, a kitchen renovation that had apparently been urgent for 15 years and was finally addressed the same year I was saving for my deposit. I had grown up in a comfortable house with comfortable things, but no savings, no pension worth speaking of. No plan for the future beyond a vague assumption that things would work themselves out. By the time I was in my late 20s, the calls had started. Not crisis calls, nothing so dramatic, not at first. More like gentle, almost casual mentions. Dad's car had failed its MOT and the repair was more than they had anticipated. Mum had seen a specialist and the private appointment had been expensive. They were between things financially, just temporarily, and if I could help with a small amount, they would sort it out by the end of the month. I helped. Of course I helped. They were my parents. The amounts were small, and I was beginning to earn well, and there was something in me, something that I now understand was not love, but its close and dangerous neighbor, obligation, that made saying no feel like a betrayal of everything they had given me. The amounts got larger, the temporary became permanent. The end of the month became a rolling horizon that never actually arrived. By the time I was 30, I had given my parents somewhere between 15 and 20,000 pounds in transfers that were always described as loans and never repaid. I told myself it was fine. I told myself family was family. I told myself, and this is the one that I am most ashamed of now, the one that I think kept the whole arrangement running for the longest. I told myself that they needed me, and that being needed was not the same as being used. It took me a very long time to learn the difference. I bought the beach house at 34. I told my parents about it at Christmas that year, over dinner, and I watched their faces do a particular thing that I can now identify precisely, but could not name at the time. My father looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and smiled, and said it was wonderful news. And he was so proud of me. My mother said the same, with additions about how she always knew I would do well. What I saw beneath the pride and the congratulations was calculation. I could not have articulated it then. I simply felt something slightly wrong in the quality of their warmth, the same way you sometimes feel a draft from a window you can't immediately locate. Something was moving that shouldn't have been moving. 3 weeks later, my father called and asked if they could come and see the house. They came in January. It was cold but clear. One of those bright winter days when the sea goes very blue and the sky above it goes very pale and everything looks like the edge of something. I made lunch. I showed them every room. I watched my mother stand at the kitchen window and look out at the water, and I saw something happen in her face that I can now describe accurately as covetousness, though I would not have used that word at the time. My father walked around the outside of the house very thoroughly. He asked about the square footage. He asked about the land registry. He asked questions that, I told myself, were the natural curiosity of a father interested in his daughter's investment. He was not asking out of curiosity. Over the following 2 years, the beach house featured regularly in conversations with my parents in ways that I gradually recognized as purposeful. My mother mentioned more than once that it seemed a shame for such a beautiful house to sit empty during the week. My father mentioned twice that if I ever wanted a lodger to help with the mortgage costs, they would be happy to help. I lived in the house every weekend and worked in Bristol during the week, and the implication being gently, persistently built was that the house was underused, that their presence in it would be logical, that the arrangement they were quietly constructing in conversation would, if I would only look at it the right way, be perfectly sensible. I didn't want it to be sensible. It was my house. I bought it for mornings alone with coffee and the sound of the water. I bought it to be somewhere that was entirely mine. I said no, kindly and consistently. My father said he understood completely. My mother said, of course, she hadn't meant to suggest anything. And then they sold their house without telling me. I found out from a neighbor. I had grown up on Hartley Road. The Prestons, who lived 3 doors down, had been neighbors since before I was born. Margaret Preston called me on a Thursday evening in October. I remember the month because it was exactly a year after I had bought the beach house, and I had been planning a small anniversary dinner for myself, alone, with a good bottle of wine to celebrate. And she said, the way people say things when they assume you already know, "Oh, Rachel, your mom and dad must be so excited about the move. Have you found somewhere lovely?" I said, "Sorry?" She said, "The house. It sold last week, didn't it? I saw the removal van in the street on Monday." My parents had sold their house, the house they had lived in for 31 years. They had listed it, found a buyer, completed the sale, and arranged a removal company, and they had not told me. I called my mother immediately. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting for this call. Her voice was carefully neutral, carefully warm, the specific vocal quality of someone who has rehearsed being reasonable. She said, "We were going to tell you this weekend. We didn't want to worry you." I said, "Where are you living?" Pause. The length of that pause told me everything before she spoke a single word. She said, "We thought, just while we look for somewhere permanent, we might stay at the beach house. It's only temporary. You're in Bristol all week anyway." There it was. The thing that had been being built, conversation by conversation, suggestion by suggestion, for 2 years. They had sold their house. They had not told me. They had nowhere to go, and they had decided, had planned, had executed that the answer was my house. My house that I had saved for 6 years to buy and had paid for entirely myself and had never once offered to them in any capacity beyond occasional weekend visits. They had not asked. They had arranged. I said, no. My mother said, Rachel, I said, no, you cannot stay at the beach house. You need to find somewhere to stay. My mother's voice changed then. The careful warmth dropped out of it, and something harder and more familiar came through. The tone I had grown up hearing when I disappointed her, when I failed to be what was needed, when I prioritized myself over the family unit, in some way she found unacceptable. She said, we are your parents. We have nowhere to go. What kind of daughter says no to her parents when they have nowhere to go? I said, the kind who wasn't told about any of this until it was already done. She said, we didn't think you'd be reasonable about it. I heard that sentence, and I turned it over in my head several times. We didn't think you'd be reasonable. What they meant, translated plainly, was, we knew you would say no if we asked, so we didn't ask. We made the decision and presented you with the consequences, and now we are going to apply every pressure available to us to make your refusal feel like the problem rather than the plan that made it necessary. I said, I need to think. I hung up, and then I sat in my Bristol flat and I thought for a very long time. I called my friend Stephanie, who has known me since we were 11 and who has, over the course of our 30-year friendship, watched my relationship with my parents with increasing concern and decreasing tact. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Rach, if you let them into that house, they will never leave. I said, I know. She said, do you though? Because you've known it before and you let it go on anyway. That was Stephanie. Never unkind, never less than honest. I said, what do I do? She said, that depends on whether you're done or not. Are you done? I sat with that question for a long time. It is not a simple question when the people involved are your parents. Ending, or significantly rewriting, a relationship with the people who raised you requires a grief of its own. A very particular grief for the relationship you thought you had, the parents you needed them to be, the version of family that turned out not to exist. I had not yet fully done that grieving. I had been carrying the £20,000 and the 15 years of small negotiations and the 2 years of suggestions about the beach house, and I had been processing none of it, just adding it to a pile and carrying the pile and telling myself that love meant carrying it. But something had shifted with the phone call from Margaret Preston. Something about the secrecy, about the deliberateness of not telling me until it was already done, about the specific calculation of it, the timing, the removal van, the managed reveal. That was not carelessness. That was not my parents making a bad decision impulsively, the way I had always excused their financial disasters in the past. That was a plan. And plans require intent. And intent, deliberate, considered intent to use me, was something I found sitting in my Bristol flat on a Thursday evening in October that I was no longer willing to absorb. I said, I think I might be done. Stephanie said, then let's talk about what that looks like. I did not say yes. I also did not immediately say the hard no that I had said on the phone and then pulled back from. I told my parents I needed a week to think, and I used that week deliberately. I called a solicitor, the same one who had helped me with the purchase of the house and who knew the deeds and the title and the precise legal boundaries of what was mine. I told him the situation. He told me that my position was straightforward. The house was in my name alone. I had no legal obligation to house my parents, and if they entered without my permission, they would be trespassing. He also told me something that I stored away carefully. He said, if you allow them to stay, even temporarily, and the arrangement becomes established, removing them later becomes significantly more complex. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent in housing disputes, and the fact that they are your parents would make any formal proceedings extremely difficult, emotionally and moderately complicated legally. I said, so I need to be certain before I let them through the door. He said, in my experience, yes. I also, in that week, called my father's brother, my Uncle David, who had maintained a careful but affectionate distance from my parents' financial habits for 30 years, and who had once, when I was about 25, said something to me that I had not been old enough to really hear. He had said, "Your parents love you, Rachel, but they have always seen you as part of their plan. You'll need to decide at some point whether you're all right with that." I called Uncle David and I told him what had happened. He was not surprised. He said, "They've been mentioning the beach house for over a year, in family conversations, talking about it as though it were a shared asset." A shared asset. My house, that I bought myself. I said, "What have they been saying?" He told me they had been describing the beach house, in conversations with relatives and old friends and anyone who would listen, as the family holiday home. They had been talking about it with a proprietary warmth that implied shared ownership. They had been, in the version of reality they were constructing and circulating, already installed. I put down the phone and I made a decision. I was going to let them come. I was going to say yes. I was going to tell them they could stay at the beach house while they found somewhere permanent. And I was going to make sure that when they arrived, they encountered something they had not planned for. Here is what I did in the 2 weeks before my parents arrived at the beach house. First, I changed the locks. Not all of them. They didn't have keys yet, which was its own oversight on their part. But I had new locks fitted, and I had them fitted with smart lock technology, keypad entry, and a log that recorded every entry and exit. This was not paranoia. This was documentation. Second, I called the solicitor again and had him draw up a formal lodger agreement, a proper legal document specifying the terms of a temporary stay. Maximum duration of 8 weeks, no alteration of the property, no subletting, no assumption of any rights of tenure, a weekly contribution to utilities. The contribution was not large. It was not the point. The point was the paper. The point was the signature. Third, I set up a camera at the front door and a camera at the back. I told my parents about both cameras. I did not tell them about the detailed conversation I had with my solicitor about the legal implications of an undocumented informal arrangement versus a documented formal one. Fourth, and this is the part that took the most preparation, I wrote down everything. Every transfer I had made to my parents over 15 years. Every amount. Every date. Every description. To the best of my ability from bank records that I requested and received. The total, when I assembled it, was £23,400. Not approximate, specific, documented. I prepared a folder, bank statements, the solicitor's letter, the lodger agreement, a covering letter that I wrote and rewrote and had Stephanie read 3 times until every sentence said exactly what I intended and nothing else. And then I drove to the beach house on a Saturday morning in November, and I waited for my parents to arrive. They came at 11. My father drove. My mother was in the passenger seat. I watched them pull up from the kitchen window. The same window that looked out to the water. The same window my mother had stood at 2 years earlier with something moving in her face that I now knew to name. They got out of the car. They had a great deal of luggage. More luggage than you bring for a temporary stay. The kind of luggage that assumes the temporary will not remain temporary. I opened the front door. My mother looked pleased. My father looked pleased, and also, beneath the pleased, watchful. Assessing the situation with that particular management career quality he had always brought to things he needed to control. He scanned the new keypad on the door. He didn't comment on it. I said, "Come in. I've made coffee." We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I drank my coffee and watched the horizon on clear mornings. I let them settle. I let them look out of the window. I let my mother say, as I had known she would, that it really was beautiful, wasn't it? And they were so lucky to be here, and it was so kind of me. Then I put the folder on the table. My father looked at it. His expression changed very slightly. He said, "What's that?" I said, "It's everything we need to cover before we talk about the arrangements. I'd like to go through it together." My mother said, "Rachel, we've just arrived." I said, "I know. I'll keep it as short as I can. I want to be fair to everyone." I opened the folder. I started with the bank records. I went through them quietly and without drama, the way my solicitor had advised. Not as an accusation, as a record. These are the transfers. These are the amounts. These are the dates. The total is 23,400 pounds. My father said, "Those were family matters. You can't just—" I said, "I'm not asking for anything back today. I'm not asking for anything at all. I just want us all to be looking at the same picture." I moved to the next page. The lodger agreement. I explained it. 8 weeks maximum, weekly utility contribution, no alterations, no right of tenure, 2 copies, one for them, one for me. My mother's expression had moved through several things since I put the folder on the table. Surprise, then irritation, then something that wanted to become anger but was being held back because she couldn't yet tell whether anger was the right strategy. She said, "A lodger agreement." "We're not lodgers, Rachel. We're your parents." I said, "I know, and I love you, which is why I want everything to be clear so that this arrangement doesn't become difficult for any of us later." My father said, This is cold. I didn't raise you to treat your family like a business transaction." I said, "I understand you feel that way. I'd still like you to read it before we discuss it." They read it. My father read it twice, with the focused attention of a man looking for something he can use. There was nothing to use. The solicitor had been thorough. My father put it down. He said, 8 weeks isn't long enough. We need more time to find somewhere." I said, 8 weeks is what I can offer right now. If you need more time after that, we can talk about it then." My mother said, "Rachel, when I needed a home for my family, I didn't give your father a folder of documents and tell him to sign them." I said, "No, and I'm not comparing what we have to a marriage. But I am telling you that this is my house, that I bought it myself, and that if we are going to share it for 8 weeks, I need us to be clear about what that means for both of us." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sea was doing what the sea does, moving, not caring, entirely indifferent to everything happening at the kitchen table. My father said, "You're really asking us to sign this?" I said, "Yes." He looked at my mother. She looked at him. Something passed between them that I recognized as recalculation. The adjustment of a strategy that had not encountered the expected terrain. My father picked up the pen. He signed. My mother signed. I took my copy. I put it in my bag. I got up and refilled the coffee and put a plate of biscuits on the table and said, "Thank you. Now, let me show you which room is yours." The 8 weeks were not easy. I want to be honest about that. The presence of my parents in the house I had built toward for 6 years was a daily negotiation of space and boundary and history. My mother rearranged the kitchen cupboards in the first week and seemed genuinely surprised when I asked her to put things back. My father had opinions about the garden that he expressed by beginning to act on them without asking. Small things, but they were not small. They were the same pattern at a smaller scale, the same assumption that what was mine was available to be reorganized according to their preferences. I held the line every time, calmly, consistently, without drama. I had learned from the solicitor and from Stephanie, and from 34 years of watching what happened when I didn't, that the line needed to be held at every instance, not just the large ones. The large ones are built from the small ones. The small ones are where it starts. At the end of 6 weeks, my father told me they had found a rental property, a 2-bedroom flat 20 minutes inland. It was smaller than what they were used to, he said. It was not ideal, he said. He said it with the particular quality of a man who is reporting a difficulty he expects you to solve. I said it sounded like a good option and asked when they were planning to move in. They moved out on a Wednesday morning at the end of November. My mother hugged me at the door in a way that had several things layered inside it. Affection, resentment, and something that I can only describe as unsettled, like a person who came expecting one thing and received another and hasn't yet decided what to do with the difference. My father shook my hand. He had not done that since I was a child. I stood at the door of my beach house, and I watched them drive away, and I felt something that I had not been expecting. I felt sad, genuinely, cleanly sad. Not for what had happened in the 6 weeks they had been there, but for the longer history underneath it. For the 23,000 pounds and the 15 years and the version of parents I had needed them to be, and the version they had been instead. For the grief of it. The particular grief of loving people who have consistently prioritized their need for you over your need to be yourself. I stood at the door for a long time, and then I went inside, and I put the kettle on, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I looked out at the water and the horizon line in the clear morning light, and I let myself have it back. I want to tell you what happened after, because it didn't end there, and I think you should know. My parents have, in the 14 months since, not spoken to me. My mother sends occasional messages, birthday, Christmas, the odd Sunday, that are carefully constructed to imply hurt without stating it, to perform a willingness to reconnect that is conditional on my acknowledgement that I was wrong. I have not provided that acknowledgement because I do not believe I was wrong. My father has not contacted me directly. Uncle David tells me he has described the lodger agreement to various relatives as a humiliation. I am at peace with being described that way by a man who sold his house without telling his only daughter and arrived at her door with too much luggage. I am also, 14 months on, still in therapy. Not because of the beach house incident specifically, but because of the longer pattern it was part of. The 20 years of giving money I couldn't afford to give, saying yes when I meant no, translating the wrongness into something smaller, carrying the weight of other people's choices, and calling it love. That work is ongoing. I think it will be ongoing for a while. That is all right. The beach house is mine. Fully, quietly, uncomplicatedly mine in a way that it perhaps wasn't before. Because before, some part of my ownership of it had been complicated by the knowledge that my parents saw it as available, as part of their plan, as a shared asset in the family story they were telling. Now that story has been corrected. The house is in my name on the deeds and in every other sense too. I wake up on clear mornings and I sit at the kitchen table and I drink my coffee and I watch the light come in sideways and I listen to the gulls. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything I saved for. I want to say one thing to you before I go, because I think it is the truest thing I know from this experience. The people who taught you to put others first were also the people who benefited most from that lesson. That is not a coincidence. And recognizing it is not betrayal. It is clarity. And clarity, even when it arrives late, even when it costs you something significant, even when it leaves you standing at a door watching people drive away and feeling the grief of what you needed and didn't get, clarity is worth it. Every single time. Subscribe to After the Funeral. There are more stories coming, and every one of them is true in the ways that matter. The truth always comes out.